The airplane cabin was bustling with the sounds of passengers settling into their seats, the occasional hum of conversation, and the flight attendants moving down the aisle, assisting travelers. The air smelled of fabric softener, mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the galley. Among the passengers was Dr. James Carter, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, carrying a medical journal in one hand and a small carry-on in the other. He had a calm, collected demeanor, the kind that came from years of experience in the medical field. His sharp suit and polished shoes suggested professionalism, but more than that, his face reflected a quiet confidence. As Dr. Carter made his way to his assigned seat, 24B, he nodded politely to a few fellow passengers before placing his bag in the overhead compartment. He slid into his seat, adjusting his watch before opening his journal. His plan was simple: enjoy a peaceful flight, read a few articles, and perhaps get some rest before landing. The seat beside him, 24A, was still empty. A few minutes later, a woman in her late 50s approached the row. Margaret Reynolds was neatly dressed, wearing a pearl necklace and a navy blue blazer. Her posture was stiff, and she clutched her purse close to her side as she glanced at the seat number on her ticket. When she saw the seat next to Dr. Carter, she stopped abruptly. Her expression changed. First confusion, then hesitation. Her eyes darted from her ticket to him, and then back again. She hesitated for a moment before finally stepping forward. Dr. Carter, noticing her arrival, politely moved slightly so she could settle in. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement, the way most strangers do when they share a confined space, but Margaret didn't nod back. Instead, she froze. For a moment, there was complete silence between them. Then, with a tight frown, she turned to the flight attendant standing nearby. Her voice was firm but low, though not low enough to go unnoticed by the surrounding passengers. "Excuse me," she said, leaning toward the uniformed woman. "I need a different seat." The flight attendant blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is there a problem with your seat?" Margaret pursed her lips, hesitating. Her eyes flickered toward Dr. Carter for just a second before she quickly looked away. I would like to sit somewhere else," she said sharply. Dr. Carter heard her but remained quiet. He didn't react, didn't frown or sigh. Instead, he continued flipping through his journal, as if completely unbothered. He was no stranger to such moments. Unfortunately, he had seen it happen before. The flight attendant looked confused. "I understand, ma'am, but the flight is nearly full. We may not have another seat available. Is there a particular reason why you'd like to move?" Margaret inhaled, as if trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. She wasn't expecting to be questioned. A few passengers nearby had now turned their heads, sensing the awkwardness in the air. A man across the aisle raised an eyebrow, watching the exchange with interest. Margaret's fingers tightened around her purse. She started again, then stopped. The flight attendant waited patiently, but Margaret only shook her head in frustration. Realizing she had no good excuse, she finally sighed and took her seat next to Dr. Carter, stiff as a board, her arms crossed. The air in the cabin felt heavier than before. Margaret sat down in her seat, but she looked tense. Her posture was stiff, and her hands clutched her purse tightly, as if she was holding onto it for comfort. She stared straight ahead, avoiding any eye contact with Dr. Carter. The hum of the airplane filled the silence between them, but it did nothing to ease her discomfort. Every few seconds, she shifted in her seat, her face showing signs of frustration. Dr. Carter, on the other hand, remained completely calm. He continued flipping through the pages of his medical journal, his expression unreadable. He had encountered situations like this before, and he knew the best way to respond was to not respond at all. He wasn't going to let someone else's discomfort disturb his peace. The flight attendants were still helping passengers settle in, and the overhead compartments were being shut one by one. Meanwhile, Margaret kept glancing at the aisle, as if hoping someone would come and offer her a way out of this situation. Her patience was running out. Suddenly, she leaned forward, and called over a flight attendant who was just a few rows away. The young woman turned and walked over with a polite smile. "Yes, Mom. Is everything okay?" the flight attendant asked. Margaret's voice was sharp but quiet enough to keep their conversation somewhat private. "I already asked for a different seat earlier. Is there any update? Surely there must be an extra seat somewhere on this plane." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing at her tablet. She scrolled through the seating chart, but her expression remained the same. "I'm really sorry, ma'am, but we are at full capacity. There are no open seats at the moment." Margaret let out a frustrated sigh. She looked around, as if hoping another passenger might offer to switch with her. But nobody did. Some had already noticed her behavior and seemed uninterested in helping. Others simply kept to themselves, unaware of the silent drama unfolding in row 24. She turned back to the flight attendant, her voice a little more urgent this time. "You don't understand. I don't feel comfortable here. I need to move." The flight attendant, maintaining her professional tone, replied gently, "I understand, ma'am, but unfortunately, we cannot accommodate your request at this time. Please remain seated as we prepare for takeoff." Margaret's face tightened in frustration. She clenched her jaw and finally sat back in defeat, her arms folded across her chest, and she made sure to keep as much distance as possible between herself and Dr. Carter. It was almost as if she was afraid to even let their elbows touch. Dr. Carter didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The way she was behaving spoke volumes, and he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he simply continued reading, as if he hadn't noticed anything at all. The passengers who had been paying attention exchanged knowing glances. They had seen what had happened, and though no one said a word, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Margaret huffed in frustration and looked out the window. She had lost this battle. She would have to sit next to Dr. James Carter for the duration of the flight, whether she liked it or not. The airplane cabin was settling down as passengers finished stowing their luggage and buckling their seatbelts. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, making final checks before takeoff. The hum of conversation mixed with the occasional beeping of announcements. But in row 24, the tension remained thick in the air. Margaret sat rigidly in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. Every few minutes, she shifted uncomfortably, as if sitting in that spot was unbearable. She glanced at Dr. Carter out of the corner of her eye, noticing how relaxed he seemed. He wasn't bothered at all. He had his legs crossed, his attention fully on the journal in his lap, flipping through pages with the same calm expression he had since he sat down. That only made her frustration grow. She let out a heavy sigh, hoping he would notice, but he didn't react. He didn't turn to look at her, didn't acknowledge her discomfort in any way. It was as if she didn't exist. The flight attendant's voice came through the speaker, announcing that they were ready for takeoff. Passengers were asked to fasten their seatbelts and put their devices on airplane mode. Margaret obeyed, clicking her seatbelt into place, but her mind was still racing. She couldn't believe this was happening. How had she ended up in this situation? She had paid for a good seat, expecting a comfortable, pleasant flight, and now she felt trapped in a seat she desperately wanted to leave. As the plane slowly began to move toward the runway, Margaret turned to the window, avoiding any chance of accidental eye contact with Dr. Carter. But no matter how much she tried to ignore the situation, she could feel the unspoken judgment from the people around her. A man sitting across the aisle, who had been watching the whole interaction, gave a small shake of his head before looking away. A young woman 2 rows ahead had whispered something to her seatmate earlier, and both had glanced back at Margaret briefly. They knew. They had seen everything. Margaret's fingers tightened on her armrest. As the plane accelerated down the runway, she closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. She told herself it was just a few hours. She didn't have to talk to him. She just had to get through the flight. Dr. Carter, meanwhile, remained completely composed. If he had noticed the looks from other passengers, he didn't show it. He turned another page in his journal, then took a slow, deep breath as the plane lifted off the ground. Margaret shifted again, feeling more restless than before. She didn't understand why she felt so uneasy sitting next to him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had been polite. He had kept to himself. But still, something inside her refused to let her relax. As the plane stabilized in the air, the seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers settled in for the flight. Margaret turned away, determined to pretend this wasn't happening. But fate had other plans. The airplane had now reached cruising altitude, and the flight attendants began moving down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Conversations resumed. The hum of the engines became steady, and everything seemed normal. But not for Margaret. She still sat stiffly in her seat, arms crossed, eyes glued to the small window beside her. The tension in her body refused to ease, and she sighed in frustration. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, she could still feel the presence of Dr. Carter beside her, calm, composed, and unbothered. Then, something unexpected happened. Margaret's breathing suddenly felt heavy. At first, she dismissed it as nerves, telling herself it was just stress. But within seconds, she felt a strange pressure in her chest. She took a deeper breath, trying to shake it off, but the tightness only grew worse. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her seat's armrest. A cold sweat formed on her forehead. A strange dizziness washed over her, and suddenly, she felt lightheaded. The cabin around her blurred for a moment. Panic surged through her. She tried to move, to sit up straight, but a sharp pain shot through her chest, making her gasp. Her breathing became shallower, and for the first time, she felt truly afraid. The man across the aisle noticed her discomfort. His brows furrowed as he leaned slightly toward her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. Margaret wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She felt her heartbeat pounding unnaturally fast. The flight attendant, who had just been handing a cup of water to another passenger, noticed the commotion and quickly approached. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" Margaret tried to nod but winced in pain instead. She could barely speak now. The world around her seemed to close in. Then, a calm but firm voice spoke beside her. "Move aside. I'm a doctor." It was Dr. Carter. For the first time since the flight began, Margaret turned to look at him directly. But now her eyes weren't filled with discomfort or frustration. They were filled with fear. Dr. Carter had already unbuckled his seatbelt, leaning toward her with complete focus. His tone wasn't angry or mocking, just professional and reassuring. "She's struggling to breathe," he said to the flight attendant. "We need to check her pulse. Get the emergency medical kit." The flight attendant, though momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events, nodded quickly and rushed away. Margaret tried to process what was happening. The very man she had refused to sit next to, the man she had looked down on without reason, was now the only person who could help her. She couldn't speak, but her eyes were wide with realization. Dr. Carter, however, wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about saving her life. Dr. Carter quickly moved into action, pushing aside any thoughts of what had just transpired. The pain in Margaret's chest was real, and there was no time to waste. He placed one hand gently on her shoulder and helped her lean slightly forward, giving her a better position to breathe. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet urgency to it as he spoke. "Try to breathe slowly, Margaret. It's okay. I'm here to help." The flight attendant returned with a medical emergency kit in hand, quickly opening it to reveal a range of supplies. Dr. Carter didn't waste any time. He reached for the oxygen mask first, placing it carefully over Margaret's nose and mouth. Margaret's hands were still trembling, but the moment the oxygen hit her, she felt a small wave of relief. The pressure in her chest began to loosen slightly, and she took in deeper breaths, though her heart still raced. For a few moments, she felt herself drifting in and out of clarity. The world seemed like a blur, but Dr. Carter's steady presence grounded her. "Just breathe, okay?" he said again, his voice gentle but commanding. Margaret could feel his calmness seeping into her. She had no choice but to focus on the rhythm of her breathing, trying to match the slow pace Dr. Carter was encouraging. "Is it your heart?" the flight attendant asked, her voice laced with concern as she stood close by, ready to assist. Dr. Carter didn't immediately answer. Instead, he kept his attention on Margaret, checking her pulse, noting the slight irregularity in her heartbeat. He could feel the subtle tremor in her wrist as he held it, his fingers pressing against her skin, searching for any signs of distress. "It could be, but I'll need to monitor her for a few more minutes." Dr. Carter responded calmly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He glanced at the flight attendants, giving them instructions. "Get me some aspirin. It could help, but we need to be prepared for anything." Margaret, still in a daze, could barely process the words. Her thoughts were clouded by panic and the overwhelming realization of what had just happened. She had always been so focused on her own discomfort with others, and now she was facing a reality where she needed help, and the person she least expected was the one providing it. Her breathing was still shallow, but with the oxygen mask and Dr. Carter's guidance, it had become easier. The pain in her chest had started to fade, though there was still an unsettling tightness she couldn't shake. Minutes passed like hours, but Dr. Carter never faltered. He kept his hand steady, his instructions clear. His focus was entirely on Margaret. He never looked at her with judgment, but instead treated her as any patient would be treated, with dignity and care. Finally, the tightness in Margaret's chest began to subside. The oxygen seemed to help, and her pulse slowed to a more normal rate. Slowly, she began to sit back, her body feeling weak but relieved. The fear that had clouded her mind was now shifting into something else, a deep, humbling realization. Dr. Carter remained by her side, observing her recovery. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone spoke volumes, and Margaret could feel the weight of the moment. "Better?" he asked, his voice soft but reassuring. Margaret nodded, her throat too dry to form words. She gave a small, shaky smile, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered. Dr. Carter smiled back, though there was no trace of triumph in his expression. He simply nodded and said, "You're welcome." Margaret sat back against the seat, still catching her breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The oxygen mask was now off, and she could breathe more freely, though the effects of the ordeal still lingered in her chest. The pain had faded to a dull throb, but the experience had shaken her more than she was willing to admit. She glanced at Dr. Carter, who was now standing beside her, giving quiet instructions to the flight attendants as they finished gathering the supplies. Her mind was racing. The shame she had felt earlier, refusing to sit next to him, turning her back on him, now seemed almost embarrassing. This man, who she had unjustly judged, had saved her life in a way she could never have imagined. She had been so focused on her own discomfort, her own prejudice, that she hadn't even considered what kind of person Dr. Carter might be. Now she couldn't stop thinking about it. She shifted in her seat, trying to focus on anything other than the thoughts swirling in her head. The other passengers around her, who had been watching with quiet curiosity, began to return to their own conversations, but a few kept glancing in her direction. Margaret couldn't tell if they were looking at her in sympathy or judgment. The feeling was unsettling. But Dr. Carter didn't seem to care about any of that. He wasn't looking for attention, wasn't waiting for recognition. He simply did his job, calm, collected, and focused. He had helped her without a second thought, without hesitation, as though it was just another day at work. For the first time, Margaret realized the kind of person he must be, his patience, his calmness, and most importantly, his ability to put others before himself. She had spent the entire flight ignoring him, judging him based on nothing more than appearances, and now, in the space of just a few minutes, he had proven to be the very opposite of what she had imagined. Margaret felt a twinge of guilt, a deep, uncomfortable sensation that gnawed at her chest. She had been wrong. So wrong. And yet here he was, still offering kindness, still offering his help without expecting anything in return. Dr. Carter turned back to her, his eyes scanning her face as if assessing her recovery. There was no hint of resentment, no hint of "I told you so" in his expression. Instead, he spoke softly, offering a simple reassurance. "How are you feeling now?" he asked, his voice steady. Margaret opened her mouth to respond but found that she had to pause for a moment, struggling to put her thoughts into words. She wasn't sure how to express the gratitude that she now felt, nor the overwhelming sense of humility that had taken over. But she knew that her earlier discomfort, her refusal to even sit next to him, now felt insignificant in comparison to what he had done for her. I'm better," she finally said, her voice quiet but sincere. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time. Thank you. I didn't realize what kind of person you were." Dr. Carter smiled gently, and it wasn't the smile of someone looking for praise. It was a simple, understanding smile, as if he had already forgiven her without her needing to say anything else. "Don't mention it," he replied softly. "You're going to be fine." Margaret nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had been saved, not just by a doctor, but by a man who had shown compassion without condition, who had set aside her ignorance and helped her without hesitation. It wasn't just about the medical help he had given her. It was about how he had treated her in the process. He had not held her prejudices against her. He had not used this moment to prove anything or to make her feel guilty. Instead, he had simply offered his help, as any decent person would. And for the first time, Margaret truly understood the importance of not judging others based on appearances. It was a lesson that would stay with her forever. As the flight continued, the hours seemed to drag on for Margaret, though the physical pain from her earlier episode had mostly subsided. She felt strangely exhausted, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came not just from her body, but from her thoughts. She kept replaying the events in her mind, struggling to make sense of what had just happened and how quickly everything had changed. After a while, Dr. Carter returned to his seat. He hadn't lingered, hadn't made a fuss. He had simply done what he needed to do and gone back to his own business. He opened his journal again, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, and resumed reading. Margaret couldn't help but admire his calmness, his complete lack of expectation. It made her feel small in comparison. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at her lap, lost in thought. But eventually, she found herself turning her head, glancing at Dr. Carter once more. His focus was entirely on his book, and for the first time since the flight had begun, she didn't see a stranger sitting beside her. She saw a person, a man who had stepped in when no one else had, a person who had given her something far more valuable than just medical care. She cleared her throat softly, hesitant, but the words bubbled to the surface before she could stop them. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his journal, his eyes meeting hers, warm and patient as always. "Yes." Margaret felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. How could she even begin to express what she was feeling? How could she apologize for her earlier actions when they had felt so thoughtless, so ignorant? "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she began, the words awkward as they left her mouth. "I was rude to you earlier. I didn't give you a fair chance. And I judged you without knowing anything about you." Dr. Carter didn't interrupt her. He simply listened, his expression calm and understanding, as if he had expected this apology all along. Margaret swallowed, feeling her throat tighten with emotion. "I didn't mean it. I've been wrong, and I'm sorry for how I treated you." Dr. Carter's expression softened, and after a moment he nodded. "It's all right," he said quietly. "It happens more than you might think." Margaret wasn't sure what she had expected in response, but his gracefulness surprised her. He wasn't angry or disappointed. He wasn't even disappointed in her. He had simply accepted her apology with gentleness, as if it was no big deal. "I never expected an apology," Dr. Carter continued. People are complicated, Margaret. Sometimes we don't always act the way we should. But I think what matters is that we learn from it. And it seems like you're doing just that. Margaret felt a small sense of relief, though the heaviness in her chest remained. I'll do better. I promise. I know I have a lot to learn. He smiled at her, the kind of smile that said he understood. We all do. That's the human experience. Always learning, always growing. The conversation was brief, but it left an imprint on Margaret. It was the first time she had spoken to someone about her mistake, the first time she had openly admitted how wrong she had been. And for the first time, she didn't feel ashamed or defensive. She felt grateful, not just for his help, but for his ability to forgive so easily. As the flight slowly made its descent toward their destination, Margaret sat back in her seat, feeling a strange peace settle over her. She knew she would never forget this moment, the moment when she had been forced to face her own prejudices, and the moment when a kind stranger had shown her that everyone deserves a chance. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, but Margaret was no longer uncomfortable. She no longer felt that uneasy distance between them. Instead, she felt a new sense of respect, not just for Dr. Carter, but for everyone. As the plane touched down, she turned to Dr. Carter once more, her face softened by a new sense of gratitude and humility. Thank you again, she said quietly, her words sincere. He nodded, offering a smile that was full of kindness. You're welcome. Take care of yourself, Margaret. And with that, Margaret knew that this experience, this encounter with Dr. Carter, had changed her. The lesson had been hard learned, but it was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. People are more than their appearances, and sometimes the lessons we need to learn come in the most unexpected forms. The plane had finally landed, its wheels touching the runway with a soft thud. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the overhead bins opened with the familiar sounds of passengers scrambling to collect their belongings. The air was filled with the usual post-flight bustle, people gathering their bags, chatting with the person next to them, and shuffling down the aisle. But for Margaret, everything felt different now. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, still absorbing the events of the past few hours. Dr. Carter, who had sat so quietly beside her the whole flight, was gathering his things, preparing to disembark. Margaret's mind was still whirling. She had never imagined a situation like this would unfold, never thought that her simple discomfort could turn into such a life-changing moment. She could feel the weight of her mistakes still sitting heavily on her chest. Her earlier actions felt so small now, so insignificant compared to what had just happened. But the guilt she felt wasn't overwhelming. Instead, it was a quiet understanding, a realization that sometimes we all need to be humbled in order to grow. And for Margaret, this was one of those moments. As Dr. Carter stood up, Margaret hesitated for a moment. She knew she had to say something, but she wasn't sure what. What could she say to a person who had done so much for her, a person she had wrongly judged without even realizing it? She reached for her bag, trying to keep her composure, but before she could stand, she turned to Dr. Carter. He was already halfway to the aisle, but he paused when he noticed her looking at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, they both just stood there in the quiet, 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them. Dr. Carter, Margaret's voice was quieter now, more humble than it had been earlier. He turned toward her, waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath, her hands slightly trembling, but there was no fear in her heart now, only sincere gratitude. I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Dr. Carter smiled gently, that same calm, understanding smile that had stayed with him throughout the entire ordeal. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with a quiet respect. He had no need to say anything. His actions had already spoken louder than words could ever express. You're welcome, he said, his voice soft but steady. I'm just glad you're feeling better. Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. I'll never forget this, she said, her voice thick with sincerity. I was wrong, and I don't think I can ever fully make up for how I treated you, but I'm going to try. I'm going to be a better person." Dr. Carter didn't respond to her apology directly. Instead, he gave her a small, encouraging nod, as though he understood exactly what she meant. There was no judgment in his expression, no trace of the earlier discomfort she had caused him. It was as if he had already moved past it, as if he had forgiven her without needing a word of apology. "It's all good," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than they might have seemed at first. "We all have our moments." With that, he turned and made his way down the aisle, his steps purposeful but measured, his back straight as he walked. Margaret watched him for a moment, feeling a mix of respect and gratitude. She knew she would never forget this man, his calmness in the face of her discomfort, and the way he had saved her, not just physically, but in a way that felt deeper, more lasting. As she stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, Margaret found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The weight in her chest had lifted, and though she was still processing the lessons learned, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. She would carry this lesson with her for the rest of her life. No matter how small or large, the lessons we learn from others often come in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes the people we least expect to help us can be the ones who change our lives the most. Margaret didn't know where her journey would take her next, but she was sure of one thing. She would never judge a book by its cover again, and she would always remember the quiet dignity of a man who didn't hesitate to help when someone needed it most.